The need for natural gas. As many of you may know, some 90% of the electric generation in New York City is gas-fired. Natural gas is the cleanest of the fossil fuels. There was a time when the entire fleet virtually was coal-fired. And there has been growth in demand. I think historically, Con Edison would tell us electric demand has ranged between 1.5% and 2%. With the recession a couple of years ago, that fell off and became virtually flat. But I think the latest data indicates that there's still some growth going on. In Astoria, for example, it's called the Astoria Energy 2 plant began commercial operation, a brand new gas-fired plant. We expect in the spring of 2012, we're going to see another approximately 500 megawatts of gas generation come on.
Those people sitting next to the DEP guy, those are Spectra Energy people. Con Ed was there too, and Spectra was here actually in Soho to just give a presentation.
We can bring gas in from the Northeast, the New England area. We can also bring gas from the typical area, the Gulf of Mexico. But we can also bring gas from out west, and also other development that's going on in Pennsylvania.
FERC's comment period is over October 31st, and we're hoping for our permits the first quarter of next year, which is 2012.
Cross Route 9A along Gansevoort Street, and then ended right here where the Whitney is going to be constructed.
You just don't go to the shelf and buy pipe that's available. When this pipe is manufactured, we don't just let the manufacturer roll it and they do their own internal inspection. We inspect it as well. The welders that are going to weld the pipe, they have to go through a destructive test, which means we physically pull apart a test weld that they do. We x-ray 100% of all the welds. We will have inspection personnel out there overseeing and monitoring the work. Gus, on his side, on the environmental, will have environmental inspectors out there fill it up with water, and we do what's called a hydrostatic test, where we pressure it up utilizing the water, and it will be pressurized 6 times higher than the pressure it will ever see. We're going to patrol the right-of-way 7 days a week. We're going to utilize remote control valves. Those valves are set up that they can close using natural gas. If the gas is there, but we don't use the gas in the pipeline. What we do is there's a volume bottle that will be utilized to support being able to cycle that valve 3 times. Our gas control group is monitoring the pressure when it goes through the valve, approximately about 2.25 miles from where our vault is, where it terminates near the Whitney Museum, heading to the east over in Jersey City. That's where we'll have a remote control valve. We'll also have valves in the vault as well. What that does is it isolates that section of the pipeline. Our system will be set up that we can run robotics inside the pipeline to determine if we need to do any type of analysis, maintenance, repairs of the system. And we'll do that periodically as the pipeline's in service. This will be one of the safest natural gas pipelines in the U.S.
Well, I have some concerns about the safety history of Spectrum. In June 2011, this year, that this company had cited 17 inadequacies in its safety operations and procedures, such as pipeline monitoring, emergency plans, and welding procedures. That there was an emergency shutdown of its Steckman Ridge, Pennsylvania compressor station, which released 1,629 pounds of lubricating oil and 6,460 pounds of methane onto farmland. That it has received the EPA's 7th highest penalty on record for discharging PCBs at 89 sites along a 9,000-mile pipeline. That it experienced a catastrophic failure of its underground storage reservoir in Moss Bluff, Texas, causing 2 explosions with flames as high as 1,000 feet, and that 2 of its gas processing plants are named number 1 and number 3 polluters in British Columbia.
The reason this is going to be different, several of those facilities that you described are not a interstate natural gas pipeline. 2, it's a closed system, so we're not going to be having any type of liquid that will be able to get into the system. And I went through and described the levels of protection and layers of safety that we as a company are committed to do. FERC in the DEIS has gone through and made their analysis as well, and they found something.
That pipeline can last. Again, for as long as that need is there, there are pipelines that were built in 1920s that are still in service.
Does Spectra obtain gases from hydrofracking?
Any shipper can have access to a pipeline to transport whatever type of natural gas from whatever region they want into our system.
When this meeting was over, I tried to ask Ed Gonzalez if he'd ever seen the film Gasland, which is a movie about fracking by Josh Fox. A person who I wasn't talking to, maybe his lawyer, told me to call their press office. I wasn't going to do that because it was 8 p.m. or so and I was finishing the article that night. So next was supposed to be the DRBC meeting, that is the Delaware River Basin Commission, but it was postponed 1 month. In the meanwhile was the last round of FERC hearings for the Spectra pipeline.
They want to keep us addicted!
They want to keep us addicted!
To oil!
To oil!
To gas!
To gas!
To coal!
To coal!
To nuclear!
To nuclear!
We
are
the sun!
the sun!
Light!
Light!
Revolution!
Revolution!
We are going to march!
We're going to march!
To the hearing!
To the hearing!
For the Spectra pipeline!
One small part of a much bigger picture. I don't understand how Governor Cuomo and his hypocrisy can on one hand be for the closing of Indian Point and then on the other hand be for fracking. Either you're for both or you're for neither.
I'm here tonight on behalf of the nearly 4,000 and counting residents who have signed petition letters opposing this pipeline. EIS makes the facile argument that dying in a pipeline explosion is far less likely than dying in a car crash. That is statistically true, since the chances of dying in a car crash are quite high. However, one car crash tends not to take out thousands of lives, destroy entire historic neighborhoods, or blow up the economy of a vital area.
These companies don't care. They have no national interest. They don't care about us. The borough president regrets that he could not be here due to personal conflicts.
This is Scott Stringer's assistant. Scott Stringer is the Manhattan Borough president. It looks like he'll be running for mayor, and in 2009, he launched the Kill the Drill campaign to protect the city's watershed from drilling. He's been an ally of the movement ever since, but no one was sure, for a long time, where he stood on the Spectra pipeline.
Borough President Stringer cannot support this project in this current form.
Scott Stringer said in his testimony that he cannot support this project as it is currently planned because of the absence of cumulative environmental impacts of potential shale gas delivery through the pipeline by FERC, and because of a binding precedent agreement signed by Spectra, Chesapeake Energy, and Stat Oil. But he would withdraw his opposition if 1. Spectra rescinds that agreement, and 2. if FERC weighs the cumulative impacts of shale gas delivery. Interestingly, he said he'd rather support the pipeline because the city has an air quality crisis and needs to get rid of 4 and 6 heating oils, because cleaner alternatives are unpractical, and because of the possible closure of Indian Point in 2016.
It's very clear to me from the evidence that's been presented that radon gas, there's a strong likelihood of it coming into my stove every time I turn it on to cook.
No fracking way!
No one can drink money. I don't need iPod. I need to be able to breathe.
Okay, I'm Goldie. I'm from Occupy Wall Street. And we are occupying Wall Street because democracy in this country has failed. And if you guys have noticed, and women have noticed, not a single person has spoken for this pipeline. I mean, I thought maybe 1 or 2 thrown into the hose, but actually, even down at the park, we're occupying very aware folk down there. We never heard of this thing until 2 weeks ago, until Gabrielle came down and told us this was being built. 2 weeks we've been canvassing the neighborhood. No one knows this is happening except the people in this room. I walked in here and there were 10 people in here. 10 people. Obviously, we filled it up with our friends here, great friends, but this is not a democracy. You can't do things like this. We're going to change that eventually, but for right now, you guys have to do something.
At 3 o'clock, we are submitting the letter requesting Japanese government to stop spreading contaminated rubble all over Japan and burn it and dump it into water at the Tokyo Bay.
In the city's anti-nuclear movement, attention shifted back to Japan because Tokyo was accepting radioactive rubble, burning it and dumping it in the Tokyo Bay, and encouraging other municipalities to follow suit. Mothers were occupying outside the Ministry of Economy in Tokyo. There were solidarity protests around the world. This at the Japanese consulate.
Stay out.
Do you have an appointment as a group or no? Just 3 people. Just 3 appointments.
There's a bunch of children who are living way too close in Fukushima to where the reactors melted. They're going to schools and contaminated schools with contaminated playgrounds. They're living in homes that are contaminated. They're touching material that's contaminated and putting it in their mouths and ingesting it. It's really a terrible situation. You're not hearing about it in the press. The press has moved on. Old story. The plant's melted. Too bad for those people over there.
Delaware! Delaware!
This is the day that we, the community, prevented the governors, the president, and the Delaware River Basin commissioners from voting to open up our Delaware River watershed to gas drilling. Governor Markell took a fresh look at the science, at the facts, at what was happening on the ground. He learned about the blowouts and the spills and the drinking water contamination. He learned about the kids and the families who were getting sick, about the fish kills, about all the devastation that was happening in all the communities where gas drilling already was. And he knew for our Delaware River watershed, this would be a bad thing.
The federal government, caught up with the Keystone XL pipeline, wasn't ready for this meeting apparently, and New York was expected to vote no because it interfered with their own regulations, and Governor Markell of Delaware voted no.
So can we take a moment together to raise our voices to say thank you to Governor Markell?
So we won this round right here, right?
The Delaware River is overseen by the DRBC, the Delaware River Basin Commission, which is based there in Trenton, New Jersey. The DRBC is staffed with some 50 people, mainly scientific, and is older than the EPA. Although there had been more than 2,000 wells fracked in Pennsylvania since 2007, there had been a moratorium in the Delaware River Basin since 2008. Their 3 concerns were flow reduction, water contamination, and waste disposal. Michael Bloomberg wrote the DRBC a letter saying to be more cautious. It referred to the unique nature of New York City's unfiltered water supply, and mentioned the Hazen and Sawyer report. It said this kind of activity should not be allowed in our watershed, and recommended that the Commission do its own site-specific study, even though there's overlap. That until then, regulations may be insufficient for a resource that we share. See, the Upper River Basin is part of the West of Hudson watershed, also known as the Catskill Delaware watershed, and shale mainly underlies the Upper Basin. And Bloomberg was even concerned about the water tunnels because of the seismic risks, which are usually due to deep well waste injection. But this land also happened to be among legally designated special protection waters since 1992. Nevertheless, even this land is leased from landowners expecting royalties from drilling.
For a lot of people in upstate New York and other places, this will be a game changer. For some people, well, very well, and for other people, not so well. But you can't be dismissive of it, and you can't be in a room here in New York City saying, oh, well, those people who say this will let me keep my farm, that's industry propaganda. I can tell you, it is not.
New York's Attorney General Eric Schneiderman and organizations filed suits against the DRBC for apparently violating NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, because they were planning on issuing permits without a federal review.
For me, the road to Trenton began in a hospital, in a small town, in an industrial area along the Illinois River, my hometown. It was here in 1979, a couple days after my 20th birthday, that I heard a doctor tell me that I had bladder cancer. And after he left, and I was still lying there exhaling anesthesia, I glanced down at a newspaper that a candy striper had left next to my bed. And the headline was about a place called Love Canal in upstate New York, and about a woman named Lois Gibbs, who was engaged in acts of peaceful protest and civil disobedience, and that were shining a public spotlight on cancer-causing and birth defect-causing chemicals in her community.
So of course this meeting was postponed until no given date, but the anti-fracking movement showed up anyway because people were invested in it. 69,800 people filed comments with the DRBC during the comment period, as Riverkeeper told me, breaking all public records of public interest.
Same chemical carcinogens and mutagens and brain poisons and hormone disruptors that I've been researching for 2 decades, and I knew how they sabotage developmental pathways, altered subcellular signaling loops, messed up gene expression, and had the power to extinguish human pregnancies at vanishingly low concentrations. These same chemicals, according to Josh Fox, he's telling me that these same chemicals are now being mixed with fresh water and used as a club to smash the bedrock of our nation and extract a fossil fuel in a process called fracking.
This was how I actually met Noelle Jefferson from Tribeca, because she had taken up interest in this issue and was now doing her own reporting on these events. Not before long, we'd be helping each other. But first the year sort of ended with a final round of DEC hearings, and I definitely wasn't the only reporter to cover the New York City one. Almost every local politician that had ever been involved showed up, tons of media, and the DEC had to use a huge auditorium in 2 sessions that day.
This movement is not about a movie.
It's not about a movie.
It's not about politicians.
It's not about politicians.
This movement is because the truth gets out. And the gas industry is lying. They can spend millions of dollars lobbying Albany, lobbying Washington, but it won't work.
Unfortunately, I couldn't stay because I had to submit a grad school application on time. The next day or so, I got on the bus with the movement to Dimmock, Pennsylvania, but I forgot my camera. Then Occupy Food happened. Then it turned out the Army Corps wouldn't translate the environmental assessment for La Via Verde to Spanish. Has there been any volunteer approach to translate it for the...
We don't feel that it's the job of a volunteer to do that. Right now, recently, an agency in the within the U.S., another federal agency released a report that is also a horrible report about the condition in Vieques.
The report saying that there is no correlation, believe it or not, between the high incidence of cancer in Vieques and the U.S. naval bombardment for the past 70 years, which is ludicrous. But at least they had the foresight to translate that 300+ page document from English to Spanish so that the people in Puerto Rico could also critique it and review it.
La libertad, la libertad.
Then I spent the holidays in California, where I dropped my camera and it broke, so I didn't have one until February. When I was there, I remember reading about the sanctions on Iran, which was bound to reduce our supply of oil from the Middle East.
This gets cast as essentially jobs, and we don't have to buy this energy from countries that don't like us. This is a national security issue versus people's health and safety. Just how important is the development of of shale gas?
It's important for the environment, obviously. If it's done right, it's important for the environment because of the emissions, fewer amount of emissions, et cetera, than coal. It's important for the economy, not just in terms of the direct jobs that are employed by the oil and gas industry, but the fact that the gas prices are down to the levels that we're talking about right now. We have a situation where a lot of industries are coming back to the United States. The Chemical Association estimated that 400,000 jobs are going to be created, $132 billion in economic impact, and that this is going to also increase a lot of the tax revenue. And unfortunately, some others think, in connection with the frac fluid disclosure issue, that if they just say, no, I'm not going to do it, then they don't have to do it. And they don't realize that that's one of the things, one of the two things that I would point out that has really put industry in the position that it is, and also make this very caustic environment for trying to resolve these issues. Is the agonizingly long time it's taking to resolve the frac fluid disclosure issue.
What the industry says is it will support 600,000 jobs, or it will support whatever the number is. Those are not new jobs. And they're mostly not jobs even in the shale fields often. In Pennsylvania, you know, a lot of these jobs are going, I hate to say it, to Texas. Or Oklahoma. You know, it's fairly well documented that this is an industry where most of the profits, when they're made, are going out of state to the areas where the companies originate.
It has not been our experience in the Fayetteville Shale that there's been fewer jobs created than was originally anticipated. The University of Arkansas did an economic impact study about the projected economic benefits. They underestimated the number of jobs. They underestimated the economic impact. It's not necessarily going to happen everywhere the same way. One of the things that we identified before we ever got to Arkansas was the fact that if we didn't do something proactive to make sure the jobs were going to be in Arkansas, then it would happen, just as Deborah said, that it would go to yahoos like me in Texas and that sort of stuff. And what we did was we worked with the University of Arkansas Morrilton, a community college, and we funded a program to help people to get the skills necessary to get those jobs. And that has worked very, very well. But that's something that needs to be thought of and planned out beforehand, or else she's right.
And today in New York State, this is where we draw the line in the sand. It is not safe to use hydrofracking. It is not right to use hydrofracking.
I got my camera fixed the day before this rally at Cathedral of St. John the Divine, which is in Morningside Heights, or the Upper West Side. I was most curious, though, about these radon tests people were doing.
It comes in a plastic envelope. Once you tear open the plastic envelope, you've activated it, so you don't start it until you really start it. And then it comes with this little piece of foam. You just shove that in there, and there's a little hook on the other end. You hang it up for 3 days minimum, or 7 days maximum. And where you hang it is the trickiest part.
This is from the U.S. Geological Survey?
Yeah, so what this shows is this is mapping radon levels in the country. So the pink areas are the high radon areas, and the blue areas are the lowest radon areas. So what's relevant here is that the blue areas, that's where we're getting our gas now.
Okay.
And this is where we're getting our gas in the future. The pink areas up here could be up to 70 times as radioactive as down here.
Power New York Act of 2011 directs the department to
to adopt these regulations by August 4th, 2012, associated with the siting of a major electric generating facility in New York State pursuant to Article 10 of the Public Service Law.
At the time the moratorium expired in the summer and everyone was wild over the state being split up, Albany passed the Power New York Act of 2011. This did two things. First, it expanded the Green Jobs Green New York program so that non-rich people could take out affordable loans for greening their homes. It's called on-bill financing. And two, it amends Article 10 of Public Service Law to protect communities that are disproportionately overburdened by environmental conditions in the siting of new power plants.
Our position when Article 10 first expired in 2003 was that given that environmental justice communities are communities that are disproportionately burdened, that we couldn't countenance power plant siting regulation that allowed additional power plants to be sited in our communities as if our pollution loads weren't already there.
This is the movement you call the environmental justice movement. People came from these EJ organizations from all over the city, representing neighborhoods that are very industrialized, heavily polluted, and represent lower income and minority populations. They were just there to give insight on how the DEC can implement Article 10, but people gave their insight on Indian Point as well.
I want to go on the record to just make sure that people understand that at least the members of the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance support the closure of Indian Point, because as concerned as we are about greenhouse gases and co-pollutants, we're that much more concerned about radioactive exposures and the kinds of accidents that could befall a facility like Indian Point.
I concur almost totally with everything that has been said already. My name is on record for the last 8 years as Director of New York AAEA as supporting Indian Point. See, because when I was growing up, I grew up next to a facility called Pfizer on the corner of Marcy and Flushing. And I went to school on Wallabout. And we had to run from our elementary school to the interior of the projects whenever it got close to 3 or 4 o'clock. Why? Because there was a mist coming down. If that plant is closed, then everything is out of the window. Everything is out of the window. Where will New York get its energy if Indian Point closes?
I saw some environmental justice groups testifying to DC the other day, and they're concerned about new power plants being built in New York City, especially if Indian Point goes offline in 2016 or something.
Con Edison's out of the generation business.
Right.
We have to buy electricity for our customers, for those who don't buy it for themselves. And we would need a reliable source of electricity. It might come through new transmission, and there are new transmission projects that are being developed right now. There have been arguments made that renewables could make up the difference, but for 2,000 megawatts, that's a lot of solar panels. And while there's a drive, and we endorse solar installations, Con Edison is in favor of solar installations. If the sun's not shining, Con Edison still has to provide electricity from another source. And that's our mandate, that's our orders, and reliability is paramount.
There's a so-called glut coming from upstate, or is that out of Con Ed's jurisdiction?
Well, the transmission, there is a transmission project that's going on right now from New Jersey into New York City. So Con Edison could take advantage of that.
I was already doing that. All right, so would there be any potential problems, you think, with harnessing all this other energy from outside of the city in Westchester, or would it be easier to just have more energy coming from within the territory? To have more power plants built or pipelines? Would that be preferable for Con Ed, or than harnessing electricity from outside?
Well, the closer the generation is to the source of customers, potentially the costs would be lower. So there are mandates for what's called in-city capacity to have electricity close to the source of its users. Yes.
Oh, okay, wow.
It's called an in-city capacity.
If those plants are built, they'll likely be natural gas plants. EPA, which subjectively calls natural gas clean energy, says gas plants emit nitrogen oxide and CO2, but in lower quantities than coal or oil. It says sulfur and mercury emissions are negligible. One thing the Power New York Act didn't do was incorporate the solar jobs bill. Instead, it ordered the state's energy department, NYSERDA, to conduct an analysis on the cost of achieving a goal of 5,000 additional megawatts from solar by 2025. The report came out in late January. It said without new mandates or incentives, the cost of achieving 5,000 megawatts exceeds the benefits in the most likely scenario. Electric rates would go up 1% on average till 2049. 2,300 jobs would be created through 2025, but 750 jobs would be lost by 2049. I wrote about this study maybe a day before it came out, but I was wrong to say it was based completely on the solar jobs bill, which Stringer was promoting on the roof of Hunter College. By the way, those panels were the product of a student project. The report estimated the cost of an SREC program, which neighboring states use to mandate utilities to buy solar energy credits. Of the 4 policies they measured, they said this was the most expensive. The least expensive, they say, involves hybrid upfront incentives and central procurement. This is basically like the current state of things. The report also acknowledges the steep recent decline in global solar prices, which are largely due to public investment elsewhere. The Solar Jobs Act will be reconsidered this year.
How many are there?
I see 5.
I feel like there should be more.
The shale gas industry was holding a summit in Pittsburgh focused on pipelines. So I crossed the Marcellus with Rizwana and Noel Jefferson for the much more accessible counter summit.
It's our right. No pipelines without a fight.
Act 13 of 2012 was just passed narrowly in Pennsylvania in February. One thing it does is prohibits local prohibition and reduces local zoning powers on all oil and gas operations. In other words, it allows the industry to move more pervasively all throughout Pennsylvania.
It's our land. It's our right. No pipelines without a fight. We'll get over this already. With this far as we're going to go.
10 to 25,000 miles of pipeline, depending on how many wells go in, which is enormous. Huge pipelines. The conventional wells are like 6 to 8 inches. These are 20 to 42 inches of highly pressurized gas going through these pipelines. You know, if there's a mistake, if somebody digs there that shouldn't be able to dig there, last year there were 3 explosions on a Tennessee transmission line. They are not in the no call. 811. You know, the gathering lines. You know,
one call.
There's no central place where these lines are recorded. There's no database. So people have nowhere to go to find out where it's safe to drill and where it's not safe to drill. We have to depend on the industry to police these pipelines. I don't want to depend on the industry because inspectors already are saying there is shoddy welding being done, there's substandard steel piping being used, and you know the surfacing, it's insufficient surfacing on the pipes.
It's pretty much a good illustration of the spider web that we're going to see in Pennsylvania through Marcellus shale wells that have already been drilled and permits that are sitting on DEP's desk. So regardless of how any of us feel about Marcellus shale drilling, pipelines are really the safest way to move fuel across the country. They've been here for decades. And again, that's part of the problem is we have an aging infrastructure that's going to need to be replaced. And as I said, the existing Marcellus shale wells are going to need pipelines. You can see that it's a relatively small pipe However, you can also see the incredibly large right-of-way that's required for the construction of that gathering line.
So that's what they mean when they say the right-of-way that would be clear-cutting through rivers and streams and forests 92 miles across Puerto Rico.
The trees on either side have a pretty short life expectancy, even though they're still here today. If you don't know where a gathering line is and you live in rural Pennsylvania and somebody's out snowmobiling, gathering lines are not always buried. Sometimes they're above ground. And when they are buried, they're maybe about 3 feet, 2-3 feet. Family out hunting. Miss the deer, they don't know there's a gathering line there. So the potential for a catastrophic event is pretty profound. These are the lines that exploded in Philadelphia and in Allentown. In 2010, there were more deaths due to gas line explosions in that 1 year than ever recorded in history, actually.
Erosion and sedimentation issues, this is what we see the most from pipeline development. These companies that are putting in gathering lines are putting them in quickly. They want to get them in, they want to get the gas from the Marcellus to the market. In Pennsylvania, you can't avoid a steep slope. We live in the Appalachian Mountains. No matter what best management practice you have, when we get stormy rains and heavy downpours, you're going to get sedimentation into your stream. The stream was muddy brown. She hiked back to the site, and they didn't have any controls in place whatsoever. So she went and she filed a complaint, and we got some action taken against the pipeline company for just discharging that into the waterways. Whenever they bore underneath streams, they use a substance called bentonite. So we saw a lot of these blowouts early on with the pipeline development in our region, and they completely destroy the streams. Aquatic life, this impacts them significantly. Fish, it clogs their gills and they can't breathe. So this actually happened in a high-quality trout stream. In areas that I represent, the reality is people have got wells in their backyards and it's happening now, and we just need to make sure what they're doing is according to regulation, get regulations stricter, and not let them get away by cutting corners. Pipelines are just cutting across the hillsides and really impacting forest fragmentation. And I know from a public health standpoint, fragmenting forest isn't that big of a deal, but it is when you look at it from an ecosystem standpoint. And when you have an interior forest that you all of a sudden instantly become an exterior forest, you've got bird species, you've got a whole laundry list of species that don't live in exterior forests and are gonna not be able to survive that instant sort of wildlife, that habitat change. And down the line, this does have an impact to us and how we live and how things go. The other environmental impacts that we're going to see from pipelines are air impacts. Linda talked about compressor stations, and we're going to see more of those as these pipelines come in. We're also going to see processing plants, but these are going to have a significant impact on our air quality with diesel emissions, with nitrogen oxides, volatile organic compounds, all of those that create ozone. And one of the things to put on focus here, and I usually have a picture with these of a coal-fired power plant. She said I grew up in the coal field, my roots in environmental organizing is coal. But we live in a region that has some of the worst air quality in the entire country because of the amount of coal-fired power plants we have in the region. So we're working on cleaning that up slowly. And if we start adding additional pollutants to it, we're not going to get anywhere, and we're still going to be known for a region with really poor air quality, higher asthma rates. The more pipelines you have, the more compressor stations you have, the more bad air emissions we're going to have, and we're never going to get down to having clean, healthy air to breathe. If you can't stop it, you got to be a watchdog. You got to be on them and let them know you're watching them.
I was thinking about Puerto Rico, and I didn't tell her, but I asked about these right-of-ways and how they might affect streams.
There aren't a lot of reproducing trout streams in southwestern Pennsylvania because of our history of mining in the past, but there are still some. And the key to keeping those streams healthy is really good riparian buffers, a shade over the streams to keep them cold enough to reproduce trout.
Is it more relevant during the construction or during the life of the pipeline?
During the installation of the pipeline is when you have the risk of erosion and sedimentation getting into it. You could have the bentonite blowouts when they're boring underneath the streams. But the long-term impact is losing that tree coverage over the stream. Once the pipeline is done, it's reseeded, it's covered, you're not going to have sedimentation issues anymore, but you have lost that tree coverage for life. They will never replant trees in that right of way because they need access to go back and do maintenance on the pipeline if they want to. But there is a practice in some locations where they can bore, and we've seen this with the pipeline that came in our watershed. They decided to bore much further out from the stream, and so they went down underground and bored under it like about 100 feet away from the stream. If you're giving access to a right-of-way on your property, you can require that. They won't always do that. It's very rare because they want that access and it costs more money to bore a lot further out than closer.
There were pipelines on the road. Noel found out about 32 mobile homes of people being evicted off the Susquehanna River basin. The landlord sold the space to a water withdrawal and pipeline company, so they were given a month or two to leave and a small amount of money, but not enough to move with.
I'm personally going to be the last one out of this part, and because I'm fighting this all the way tooth and nail to the end. I mean, they're going to have to come with the sheriff's office and take me away in handcuffs.
You think there's a more appropriate place for them to do it, to get the water?
I mean, I know darn well that, a 3 million gallon a day pump isn't gonna fill up this field. It's 3 million gallon a day. Then they're gonna go all the way out to the highway, down the highway, and then they're gonna cross underneath throughout 220 and go 15 miles north of that, and then all the way up on top of these mountains, so they can get all the water that they need, to do their fracking.
We need to figure out and do in each state, as we've done in Arkansas, and that is to move water as much as possible by pipe. Because the roads in the southern tier of New York, just like the roads in the northeastern part of Pennsylvania, just like the roads in Arkansas where we were not built to take this type of traffic. And there's going to be road damage.
2 summers ago, the farmers were told that they weren't allowed to draw any water out of the river because the river was getting too low. So now here we didn't even have a winter. We might as well say we didn't even have a winter. Normally there's 2 feet of snow melt on the mountains sticking down, help replenish the water supplies. There's nothing.
Act 13 involves some new environmental regulations, including a required water withdrawal analysis to be reviewed by DEP upon water withdrawal. But Kevin June told us he's seen the river so low you could walk across it, and was talking about other people who might be affected by these facilities, like water truckers and farmers.
And then that's where a lot of the activists are going to start voicing their opinion, saying, whoa, 2 years ago we couldn't pump 1,000 gallons an hour because, we need to feed our crops over there.
Back in New York, Spectra still needed to get a grant of easement from the Hudson River Park Trust, which held a hearing on West 10th Street on March 26th. By the time I got there, people who were fed up with this system and outraged by the money the trust would receive from Spectra were staging a boycott.
Keep on cheering at this hearing. Keep on cheering at this hearing.
You can't really argue against people who decide they don't want a particular thing in their neighborhood. That may be their call, however rational or irrational the fears may be.
The FERC process, if one followed it carefully, and clearly they're an enabling agency. If you read the EIS, they have a responsibility, as people have stated, to actually prove need for this gas. Within that document, only 20% of the gas is being signed on for by Con Ed. The remaining 80% is being signed on by Chesapeake and also by Stat Oil. So there aren't users for this gas at this point in time.
There's an industry overstatement of the need. Based on the New York State Energy Plan, after 2011, the demand will actually decrease and remain steady until 2020. There's no decisive factual need for the Spectra pipeline. It's obvious this pipeline is mostly for the city's benefit, mostly not for the city's benefit, but primarily for export.
It's about reliability. It's about making sure that customers who want the natural gas get the natural gas. So it's a reliability issue.
I assumed it was just to bring gas into New York City, but it appears from what I've been hearing that there's an export issue, so that maybe this seems to be an issue that this might be a liquefied natural gas port, which will be used for export. That may be, I don't know. So if that's the case, there's possibly an argument for a different route. But in terms of what it means in a bigger picture, building a pipeline means people go to work. People go to work building the pipeline. They go to work drilling the gas. They bring a lot to the local economy.
If you go through that same EIS, they have to prove that there aren't alternatives to using the gas. So they'll talk about the renewable efforts that New York City are, developing right now with respect to.
Remember that woman with the blonde hair?
Wind, solar, tidal, etc. And you read these sections and you go, boy, it sounded good, it sounded good. And at the end of this paragraph, which looks so optimistic, they say, oh, but we can't do that.
The application is the most hazardous and obviously dangerous application ever presented to FERC. As a security issue, this proposed Spectra pipeline presents a plethora of security issues. Issues regarding Stuxnet, a computer malware that has now become a focal point for the NSA and the Department of Defense, puts utility computer control at risk.
Oh look, everyone. It's a map for the terrorists. When a pipeline the same size blew up in California, it created a crater half the size of a football field and 4 stories deep. And 9 people died. But they estimate that a lot more people would have died if everyone from the community had not been at a PTA meeting.
I only learned about this issue a couple of weeks ago. I'm just a resident and a mother, and I'm terrified. I mean, there is going to be a storage vault of high-pressure gas 6 blocks from my house. There can be an accident. There was an earthquake last year. There are terrorists who know how to hack computers. This pipeline is controlled by computer. We ourselves in Iraq hacked the computers and blew up oil wells.
There's been several explosions in Chelsea, and there's not one month that a truck from Con Ed is not in our block. And we ask the supervisors why, and they tell us it's because the infrastructure of Con Ed is falling apart, is 100 years old, and the city has no money to replace it.
Right here, right down here, just out of frame, is the toddler's playground.
If there were an explosion, any kids on that pier would be gone, as well as an awful lot of other people.
I don't know how familiar you are with the whole long story of this pipeline, but what do you think about maybe like moving moving the playground or building it somewhere else or rerouting it so it doesn't go through Jersey City?
Well, the issue here is, as I said, if there's a land use issue and people are frightened about something, that's hard to argue against in a densely populated area. I mean, the risk might be low enough. It might be no greater than any other risk we face. I mean, people talk about the kids and living in the city and so forth, but there's cars in the street, people get hit. There's all kinds of risks are out there, and we've still got 50 or 60 million people who smoke cigarettes in this country. And so when I hear about, you're going to get radon-induced lung cancer, I'm thinking, well, I don't know. But as far as routing it another way, well, that's a common thing. Maybe that's the answer. And I don't know about the pipeline, about the playground specifically, because I don't live in this neighborhood. But there's got to be a rational way to approach it. Some kind of compromise that everybody can live with.
We're going to do what BP does and just, they had people that came aboard the Deepwater Horizon a few hours before it blew, and they had a cocktail party. You know, we can't take this decision lightly. I run an event space in Chelsea. Everything I do, I get insurance forms from people. You know, I do my due diligence. You know, it's my job to be worried about things that could happen. You know, I make sure every insurance form, every contract, you know, because I don't want to be responsible if something happened and I didn't do my job, you know? So who is this company that's gonna build this, that has all these violations?
Spectra was the one who sought to provide the pipeline over land because it was cheaper. The other people were bidding for it to be going through the Hudson River and connect directly from Staten Island.
Scott Stringer, he does not support this pipeline if it has shale gas in it. In New York City, the mayor, they don't want to frack in the watershed for the gas, but no, we still want the gas.
Natural gas obviously is cleaner burning than oil. Requires less, it makes fewer emissions. If there's natural gas coming to a home or business, that means that a home or business in the city or Westchester County will not have to have deliveries of truck deliveries of oil. So natural gas is good for the environment.
Was that also like an economic thing that we wouldn't have to have the deliveries of oil, or is that mainly environmental?
Well, just think about it. If you have fewer trucks in the city of New York, delivering less oil.
You know, both Ford and General Motors produce vehicles that run on it, and there are probably 15 or 20 motor vehicle manufacturers around the world that actually right now produce factory models that run on natural gas. You know, we need a little infrastructure change to accommodate that, but technically it's, you know, all the hard work is done.
It's crazy because, like, here they're building a museum, but over there they're building a pipeline. I guess that's all part of the museum too. A lot of people think that it's just for meat packing or the West Side.
No. We serve natural gas customers in Manhattan, in the Bronx, in Westchester, and a portion of Queens.
Because I think later on, I've heard of a pipeline coming into Brooklyn, and that doesn't even concern Con Ed.
No.
I see Con Ed's green things all the time, telling people to save energy.
Yes.
Could you speak to any of Con Ed's green programs?
Con Edison has programs for homeowners, for apartment owners, for commercial businesses, for industrial businesses. There are incentives for all kinds of customers, whether they're residential or business owners. The state has programs through NYSERDA. There are lots of programs to help customers on whatever levels and whatever economic strata to conserve energy. And if you conserve energy, you're helping on a number of levels, because you're helping the environment, number one, and with using less electricity, there's then less of a need to put copper in the ground, to tear up the streets, to build more infrastructure. So it's a savings plan that goes just beyond one block or one community or one borough.
Abraham Lusgard, perhaps you can wrap this up for us. You know, as a journalist here.
Like I spent half the year in 2008 and 2009, you know, in Wyoming and in Texas, and as New York was in the depths of recession, these places were booming, and there's a reason for that. And so there's a lot of benefit to be taken from this development. This is and always will be a boom bust kind of development. I mean, Rifle, Colorado was a town, tens of thousands of rich people in the 1980s as the country sort of poured itself into oil shale development. And in the space of weeks, its main street was shuttered and the population had dropped to like 3,000 people. The town is decimated, and then it comes back slowly as we go into, in that case, a tight sands, deep gas drilling boom. The Barnett Shale, they've had a good run, a good 10 years in that part of Texas. But those wells are drying out, and Texas this summer faced unprecedented water problems. It has a shortage of supply while using billions for fracking, among other things. It's suing its neighboring states for access to water, and it will not have the same ongoing natural gas production, at least in that Fort Worth area, that it enjoyed for the last decade. They'll find it elsewhere, but for now, it's disappeared.
Well, the time has come that we need to thank our panel.
Oil, all the above. Hey, Obama, show us some love.
Friday was the anniversary, the second anniversary of the BP oil disaster. Today, April 22nd, 2 years ago, the Deepwater Horizon oil rig sank into the Gulf of Mexico, releasing millions of gallons of crude oil, and following that, BP released a couple million gallons of chemical dispersants. This disaster has destroyed countless lives, countless livelihoods, as well as the ecosystem of the Gulf of Mexico. And the BP disaster is far from over. Crude oil continues to wash ashore. There are 12 million people living in the Gulf, and a survey released this month has said that over 87% of residents, of workers, and cleanup workers exposed to contaminants, including crude oil and dispersants, are suffering from chronic illnesses, including headache, fatigue, memory loss, nausea, chest pains, skin irritation, lesions, boils, vomiting, numbness in the body, and abdominal pain. Many of these people do not have health insurance. There are also disturbing reports of abnormal numbers of dead dolphins and sea turtles washed ashore. The Obama administration has seriously ramped up our extraction of dirty energy. So we're here today to call for an end of this policy and to call it out for what it is. It is psychotic, it is toxic, and it is ecocidal. And if our administration won't help us, then we need to stand up and call on BP to be held accountable, to pay for the damage for our Gulf Coast, to take care of our people and our environment.
Keep your fracking pipeline. 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 We are the people. Two. You can't ignore us. Three. We will not let you poison our water. One. We are the people. Two. You can't ignore us. Three. We will not let you poison our water.